LCSC students of African history, Professor Eric Martin here. And today I want to try to talk in 15 minutes, I hope, about our next set of readings, which come from this book, The Atlantic Slave Trade, and how I envision us approaching these. It's a little different style of book than what we've dealt with so far. So the first thing you're going to want to know is how to access the readings. And just go into our course modules. Let me put that to student view so it looks the way it looks for you. Hopefully this will not say needs video by the time you look at it. And then the modules lay out how we're going to conduct the discussions. And then the readings are here on a PDF. And it may take a few minutes for this to download, but I've been messing with it and it will download. So that should be fine. So the point is, all the readings are available to you via PDF. The book itself is organized into 6 different themes, and each of those themes, the editor, David Northrop, presents 4 or 5 or 6 big name historians. It's mostly secondary sources. There's a few primary sources in there who have been important in the development of the field, and in some cases who either add on to each other's arguments or maybe even contradict each other's arguments. So it's an interesting way to look at historiographic debate. So I want to go through a few of the topics first, some issues in terms of why we're reading this, and then I'll get into how to deal with the discussions, I think. So I'm just working out of the modules right here. Well, let's talk for just a second. And this just comes straight out of David excuse me, David Northrop's intro. In terms of why the topic itself is important. And he lays this out in his intro. I don't think I gave you guys the intro, but it goes something like this. First, the migration of Africans into the Americas was huge, in the many millions. And the number he gives is by 1820. Now I realize that's 200 years ago, but by 1820 there are 4 times as many African immigrants as European immigrants in the Americas. And that's Americas with the big A, right? So you can just kind of keep that in mind in terms of genetic imprints in the hemisphere and cultural imprints in the hemisphere. Next, the slave labor systems in the New World, particularly thinking about sugar plantations, thinking about cotton plantations, particularly thinking about sugar plantations, is associated with the very first wave of the rise and development of European capitalism. So it's hard to understand this issue about the development of European business models, the development of European capitalism in general, without understanding how the Atlantic slave trade is connected to it. Third, another reason this is important is that the end of the slave trade, in terms of the abolitionist movement, it's a really interesting debate, right? Because it is one of the greatest turning points in Western moral consciousness, right? Maybe, because there's a lot of debate over what generates the end of the slave trade. Okay? And then finally, the the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, and the business models, and the economic models, and the cultural models, you just can go on through it, right? Put into motion. What happens throughout the 20th and 21st centuries after abolition. Not saying it's the only thing. I'm saying it is a thing, and it's important to kind of understand how it works. It might help explain some things around us. So those are some good reasons for us to look into the subject of the Atlantic slave trade. And it's been my general sense that a lot of us don't know a lot about it. And a lot of us, it's just my experience that a lot of us don't know a lot about it. So this is a good opportunity for us to learn something about it. So let me switch things up here and show you, some ways that the book is organized in terms of how we're going to approach it. So the book is organized into 6 different sections. We are going to have discussions over each section. I'll get into that in just a little bit. The first section is focused on the issue of why Africans specifically were enslaved. Okay, so that's the very first discussion we're going to have. There are 4 documents by Williams, Jordan, Davis, and Eltis, all looking at this issue about why is it that Africans were enslaved. Some of them will build on each other. Some of them will disagree. We're going to break down those documents. We're going to talk about it and see what we come up with. Next issue is going to look at the slave trade within Africa. There was a trade in human beings internally within Africa before the Europeans showed up. So we want to get a sense through a couple of primary source documents and then a lot of secondary source documents what that slave trade internally looked like pre-European contact and how that slave trade internally may have changed after European contact. All right. And what are the, for some of y'all may remember from History 102, I'm thinking about the letter from the King of the Congo to the King of Portugal. He's making this argument that the Portuguese are here and they're collecting slaves, and on the one hand we get it, we have slaves, but there's rules to the game and the rules are being ignored and it's distorting the whole thing. So check that part out. We'll come back to this. The next thing that we're going to deal with, all right, I think that's still the student view. Oh yeah, of course. All right, it's all right. The next thing we're going to deal with is the Middle Passage and looking at the transport from Africa into the New World, how that works, how we know what the numbers are, how we know who's coming from where, what kind of historical work is being done with that. It's actually pretty interesting, right? So we've got this primary source from Equiano, and then we've got these pieces from Buxton. Curtin, there's no bigger name in the game than Curtin. He is really the first person that tries to pinpoint numbers. How many people are we talking about? Klein, Eltis, and Richardson. What are the historical techniques that these people are using to try to get an accurate historical representation of this trade that happens 200 years ago? Some of it, in the shadows, some of it not so much. Next, the effects of the slave trade within Africa, looking at Walter Rodney, Patrick Manning, who I studied under, Thornton, these ideas about what were the impacts internally within Africa as a result of the slave trade. And you're going to see some debates. They don't all necessarily agree on what the impacts are. And the short version of the discussion is some of these authors make the argument for a greater degree of African agency. They knew exactly what they were doing. And others make more of an argument for African having things imposed on them, right? And that's a kind of a big deal. So just pay attention to the debate on that. Next. Effects in Europe and the Americas. And it's the same thing. So we've got these authors here, Williams, Drecker, Hall, and Morgan. How do they say it affects things in Europe and things in the Americas? Again, there's some debates in terms of how it plays out. And then finally, we have the part on abolition. And why does it end? How does it end? That's the deal. So these are the 6 big things we're gonna get into with this book. Okay, that's that part. So how are we going to go about having these discussions? We're going to go about having it 2 different ways. Okay, we're going to run discussions on all this stuff for 3 weeks. 2 weeks, it's going to be more or less the same, and the 3rd week, it's going to be a little different. Here we go. Okay. The first week, chapter 1. If your name is connected to one of these documents, you are responsible for breaking it down. When I've done this class in my face-to-face versions, I have done this as group presentations. You get in front of the class, you break it down on a PowerPoint slide, you and your group get together, and you present it to the class. I struggled with whether I should try that in this class or not. I've opted not. But my point is that when you click on this bad boy right here to send you to the discussions, it lays out that Dalen and Logan, for example, by Tuesday, February the 25th, are going to have a detailed posting of at least 150 words breaking down this is what the Eric Williams document says. You guys want to go way over 150? Doesn't bother me. You guys want to coordinate with each other? That's cool too. That makes a lot of sense. You don't like working with other people, then do your own thing, and you guys try not to be too repetitive, because you don't want one person to post up something and another person just post up the same thing. But the way we're going to run this is you got to have something up by the beginning of the day on Tuesday, and you got to have it finished off by Thursday. Anybody who wants to participate can. Now, let me go back to this, finishing off by Thursday. Dale and Logan's going to have their stuff up about Williams by the end of the day on Tuesday. Calissa and Wyatt Jordan by the end of the day on Tuesday. Hannah Courtney by the end of the day on Tuesday. Davis. Hannah Cody the end of the day. Eltis. Okay? But we've got some grand conclusions. And all of y'all involved in this discussion are responsible for getting involved in the grand conclusion discussion by the end of the day on Thursday. All right? What's it all mean? We'll figure it out. Okay. You guys can just see all this stuff right down here. If you've had me for History 101 or 102 in the online versions, it should look familiar. I'm just trying that format. Now, this same week, the rest of the class is dealing with Chapter 2. Cade and John breaking down Park, Joshua and Nicole Hare, so forth. except y'all's initial postings are not due until Thursday, right? Because the idea is you're supposed to be reading all this. I'm not going to make you write a paper on everything to ensure you're reading everything, but that's how you're supposed to be doing it. So y'all are going to have your breakdowns of the documents up by the end of the day on Thursday. You're going to have your grand conclusions by the end of the day on Saturday. And then we're going to move on to the next phase. Okay? So Chapter 1 gets broken down by Tuesday, grand conclusions by Thursday. Chapter 2 gets broken down by Thursday, grand conclusions by Saturday. Alright. The next week, we're doing exactly the same thing, but in a slightly reverse order, in the sense that the group that went first and second are being switched around, right? So, same thing the next week. Chapter 3 stuff, you guys break it down by Tuesday, get it discussed by Thursday. Chapter 4, get it broken down by Thursday, get it discussed by Saturday. I know that the deadlines on that can be difficult for those of us with jobs, but I hope I'm getting this up early enough to where if you have those kinds of concerns, you can get out ahead and at least get your breakdown up early, and then you can kind of see how the grand conclusion should go, right? And the grand conclusions is trying to connect all the documents, how do they differ? How are they the same? Because one of the things you're going to be asked to do in your final formal essay for this class is use some of these documents in that essay to make some kind of a statement about studying African history. And here's an opportunity. Well, how are people studying the African slave trade? How are the number crunchers who are trying to put numbers down figuring it out? How are the folks that are making some kind of a statement about the development of capitalism figuring it out? How are folks that are taking a more cultural approach, figuring out? There's these different angles, and that's really what you're looking for here, is the different angles that folks are using for studying the slave trade. Again, if you guys want to all submit individual documents, be my guest, but it does seem that in this particular case that Courtney and Hannah C could coordinate with each other and talk a little bit about the Manning piece and write some stuff out together. It's up to you guys, right? Whatever seems to be the most straightforward. That's the first 2 weeks, the first 4 chapters. And then I switch things up, I hope for the better. And the final 2 chapters, it's the same time frame, except the idea is, okay, well, if your last name begins with the letters A through K, you're supposed to get that discussion cooking, right? And it's slightly different. Excuse me. It's slightly different just in the sense that you're supposed to have some initial postings up by Tuesday the 12th, and some follow-up on Thursday. It's a slightly different form. I'm hoping that we're all able to handle the looser structure just to kind of see where it goes. There's a few smaller documents. So I thought we'd roll with that and see what happens. Okay, so you guys don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're reading this book. We're taking 3 weeks to talk about 200 pages. This is a history class. You're being asked to read something like 65 pages over per week. It's not a lot. Now, granted, it's different documents. Some of it's not the easiest. As a result, the week before this, all you guys had was a video. So if you can get in here and read one document a day, you should be all right. Take notes on it. You want to make sure you understand who the author is in this particular assignment. It is huge. It is huge. Some of these people are very famous. You're going to want to know what they're famous for. Some of these people are, they observed things at the time. Some of them are participants at the time, but most of them are historians that have been attempting to put together the Atlantic slave trade in general. You're going to run across Eric Williams' name all day long. Get a sense of who he is. You're going to run across Phil Curtin's name all day long. Get a sense of who he is, because a lot of people they did groundbreaking work, and that encouraged a lot of people to challenge it, and a lot of people to attempt to coordinate with it. And you want to kind of get an idea about where these different authors fall into that. And then so one document at a time, look your authors up, get a sense about what element of the slave trade, what part of the story they're trying to put together, get an idea about what kind of camera lens they're using, right? It's a very different camera lens if somebody's trying to put together a economic picture of the slave trade compared to someone trying to put a cultural picture of the slave trade together, even though they might be interested in the same sources. I'll give you the quick example. They may both be interested in insurance records, but somebody putting together a business angle on the Atlantic slave trade through insurance records may be looking for how much were slaves purchased for, how much were slaves sold for. I want to get an idea about whether or not the slave trade was profitable. They're looking for numbers of money. Somebody trying to put together a cultural picture may be looking at that same receipt, but they are more interested in place names, right? This person is being picked up in Angola. They're being sold in Brazil. And as a result, and then they're trying to look at the names of people and see if they can figure out who goes from where to where. And you're using the same source, but you're interested in different stuff, right? So pay attention to that. You can imagine a scene in which someone, I'm just going to stick with the same source, those insurance records, right? Where someone is interested in the number of males, number of females. Do we get a sense of any children? Like who is actually on the journey and how does that play out? So you're going to have different scholars interested in different things trying to put together the different elements of this trade. And that's what this is all about. So we've got a book here that's got 6 different themes. Each theme's got, 4 or 5 different angles on the theme. And so your mission is get a sense about how that theme has been studied. Get a sense about who the big scholars are that do this kind of thing. For if you're interested, if you're still on the quest for outside readings, almost any of these authors would be excellent people. If it's like, wow, I really like that piece. These are all parts of bigger works that are pretty cool. Again, the mission here is to give us a sense of the historiography, how the slave trade has been studied, so that in the future, if you decide you would like to learn some more about this, you've got a pretty good resource for, okay, here are the big names, here's kind of how they pan out, and here's, how they connect with each other. And that's what we're doing on the discussion boards. So don't make it harder than it needs to be. Like I said, I used to do this with in my face-to-face classes with presentations. I wanted to try something different this semester and just see how this works. All right. If you got any questions, show up for online office hours. Send me an email. Don't panic. I think it's all going to work out. Good luck.